Amen. Now, you're going to have to go somewhere different because everything is flip-flop today for some reason. It's Mother's Day, and so Ken preached a sermon out of the Old Testament, and here I am preaching a sermon out of the New Testament. It's going to be strange. On top of the fact that it's going to be strange just where I'm at. By the way, I'm in 2 Timothy, and you can open up there, and then put your finger in Acts chapter 14. Right in that area. Put your finger in those two places. That's the areas we're going to be covering today. But as I thought about this sermon, I've been preaching through the prophets. And so like last week, we did 3 whole chapters in 30 minutes. Today, I'm going to do 3 whole verses in 30 minutes. So it's going to be a different kind of sermon than what you're used to from me on Sunday nights. And I thought, to be honest, this is going to be really easy to prepare for. And then I realized I wrote just as much and I took just as much time to prepare for 3 verses as I do for 3 chapters. So hopefully that you guys get some stuff out of this. I was thinking about mothers, and I read this story about a 2nd grade teacher, and it clicked with me because my wife is a teacher. She teaches 5th grade. Next year she's going down to 3rd grade. But it was a story about a 2nd grade teacher, and this 2nd grade teacher wanted to do a lesson on magnets. And so she gave all the kids these magnets, and she had them go around the class and see what they can pick up and what they can't pick up. And so they got to experiment in the classroom trying to figure out these magnets. Then the next day she gave the kids a test, and in that test there was a riddle. She said, "My name has 6 letters. I start with an M, and I pick things up." Now, all the tests came back, and wouldn't you know it, the kids put mother as the answer to that question. Mother. My name starts with an M, I have 6 letters, and I pick things up. Now, you're hoping they would have figured that out with the magnets, but no, they wrote mother. And I think the reason they did that is because a lot of times kids think their mom's job is to just pick things up. Who's been a mom before? Right? Do you feel like that might be your identity, your job is to pick things up? Or maybe you've had a mom and you think their job is to pick things up after you, right? Like that tends to be the way that we think of mothers. But I want you to think more about mothers than just somebody who picks things up, because mothers are so much more. In fact, I think mothers are even more than just the term mom. I mean, they're a whole person, right? When I think about my wife, who's a fantastic mom, she's not just a mom, she's a wife. She's a teacher. She is a friend. She's got all these different identities. She's a Christian, and inside this church, she's a singer. And so she's got all these hats that she wears, and being a mom is just one of those hats. And it's important to remember that, because sometimes we want to just like shrink Mother's Day down to it's just about my mom and what she did. But we are moms, and like moms are more than just that one thing, that one identity. There's so much more. Their job is not just to pick things up. But God did command mothers and fathers, but it's on Mother's Day, so fathers get a break today. But God commanded mothers to share the story. See, when the people were leaving Egypt in that Passover dinner, they were supposed to tell these things to your children, remind them to your children, write them on your doorposts so that you will not forget your story. And so mothers and parents in general have an obligation by God to share their faith with their children. That was God's ordained plan. And so if you're a mom and you're wondering, like, what's my calling? Your calling, first and foremost, is about that motherhood, that bringing up your children in the way that they should go. That's that hat that is very prominent in the mother's life. I'm not saying it's the only hat they wear, but it's a very prominent hat that they wear, right? And so I was thinking about all the different struggles that moms might have today. I mean, we live in a culture where, like, not everybody in our community really knows, believes, or worships God. And we send our kids, me in January, we send our kids to a school where they're interacting with a lot of different people who do not know, believe, or worship God, right? I mean, they may even worship other things. That's becoming more and more common. But the culture that parents and mothers are trying to raise their children in is challenging. And then if you look at the family structure of parents today, it's even more difficult. Sometimes you'll have a believing mom and an unbelieving dad, or vice versa, right? So the family structure can be difficult. And I think the Bible is full of examples of women who have overcome these obstacles. And so I started looking at who is a woman who has overcome this obstacle, and the name Eunice popped up. Now, how many of you know who Eunice is? Raise your hand. Only Mary Beth, right? And that's okay because she's only referenced twice in the New Testament. Well, you didn't raise your hand, Harry, so if you don't raise your hand, you don't count, right? That hurt. Okay, she gets all the credit, right? But if you don't know who Eunice is, that's okay. She gets 2 references in the Bible, and one of the references she gets in the Bible, she's not even given a name, she's just that Jewish woman. And so look at 1 Timothy. I'm going to show you the reference of the Bible where she does get a name, and really where we're going to be sticking to today. This is 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 3 through 5. Here's what he says. I thank God, whom I serve as my ancestors did, with a clear conscience, as night and day I constantly remember you in my prayers. Recalling your tears, I long to see you so that I might be filled with joy. I remember your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded now lives in you also. And that's the big part that Eunice gets in the Bible is Paul remembers Timothy, and he can't think about Timothy without saying, oh yeah, I remember your grandmother, Lois, and your mother, Eunice, and they had a sincere faith that lived inside of them, and I am convinced now also lives in you. That's Eunice's role to the Bible, is she is somebody who passed on to Timothy a heritage of sincere faith. Now, I don't believe that it was easy for Eunice to do this. Like we might just assume that maybe Timothy grew up in a bubble, a Christian or a Jewish bubble, that he was taught the Holy Scriptures from infancy, and so he just had the perfect opportunity to grow up as a strong Christian. But when you read the book of Acts, you find out that's not really the case. See, Eunice had a challenge. She had to raise Timothy in a culture that was really difficult. And that's why I told you to look at Acts chapter 14. In Acts chapter 14, we get to meet the town that Timothy grows up in, right? He grows up in a town called Lystra. And it's not much of a town as far as towns go. It's so small that it doesn't even have a synagogue. Now, we're in Acts chapter 14, and right around 13 is where I'm going to start reading. But you're actually in verse 8 with Lystra and Derbe. When Paul and Timothy are on their first, or Paul and Barnabas are on their first missionary journey, they go into the town of Lystra, which is the place where Timothy grows up and where Eunice raises Timothy. And they see a man who's crippled and they heal him. The town finds out that this miracle has happened, and they all go and look and see who this Paul and Barnabas is. They think, this town of pagans, believe that Paul and Barnabas are Zeus and Hermes. So they called Paul Hermes and Barnabas Zeus, right? What I want you to see about this town is that it was a town that was pagan. In verse 13, it says, the priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bowls and wreaths to the city gates because of the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to them. The them in that text is Paul and Barnabas. But when the apostle Barnabas and Paul heard this, they tore their clothes and rushed out to the crowd shouting, friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God. And so I just want to stop there to just point out the town Timothy grew up in was not the perfect Christian bubble, right? Timothy would have went to, he would have been walking around town and saw, oh, there's the temple of Zeus. And there's the temple of Hermes. And he would have been surrounded by that, just as my kid is surrounded in his school with people of diversity and different ideas. And I wonder, how did Eunice raise Timothy to be a man that honors God in a culture that didn't? That would be a really difficult job. In fact, Christians today want to pull their kids out of that and put them in a bubble, right? So that they can raise their kids behind, the safety of their doors. But Timothy was not raised behind the safety of anybody's doors. He was raised in Lystra, a town where people worshiped other gods. It was also a violent town. If you know anything about this town, this is also the same place where Paul is stoned. And that's not a good thing. He was put to death, right? Like he was stoned to death. And he also gets back up and walks back into this town. So this town turns from paganism to we want to worship you to we want to kill you. Like that, right? And I'm just saying, this is where Timothy grew up in. It's not the perfect Christian bubble. It's a lot like the places that we raise our children today. Also, Timothy would have had struggles within his family. Turn your page to chapter 16 of Acts. Timothy would have had struggles within his family. See, Paul and Barnabas left, but when they came back to Lystra in chapter 16, they meet Timothy. And this is the first time we actually get to meet Timothy, the boy from the town that worships pagans. And here's what it says. Paul came to Derbe and then to Lystra. Remember, that's where we were just at. Where the disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was Jewish and a believer, but his father was a Greek. Now, I might just be reading into this. And some of this, I'm just making assumptions. But I might just be reading into this. And I think what Luke might be saying is, in Lystra, they met Timothy, whose mother was Jewish and a believer, and whose father was Greek and was not. And so maybe Eunice had to raise this boy that honors God in a broken home, like many of the mothers today are trying to raise their children in broken homes. And I don't know that, but it seems to make sense to me. Like why would Luke not put much about the father except for he was a Greek? And I know that Eunice did not win every argument when it came to how to raise Timothy. In fact, I can think of one argument that I know for sure she lost, right? See, on the 8th day, if you were Jewish, you were supposed to be circumcised. And when Eunice looked at her son, who was half Jewish and half Greek, she had to wonder, can I raise him in the way, on the 8th day, do I circumcise him in the way that complements my values, my belief system? Or do I allow him to live like his father, the Greek? And she's overruled in that one. And so Timothy has to do something that I don't know, like this is a strong and amazing amount of faith, because Timothy has to wait to get circumcised until he's old. And ouch. But he was still willing to do that. Why? Because he wanted to serve God. And I just think Eunice lost that battle. At least I assume she lost this battle. And so what I'm trying to show you is that Eunice and Lois, they raised Timothy to be a person of sincere faith, but they do it in a town of pagans that honors Zeus and Hermes, and they do it in a broken family. Now, that's a lot of assumption. Maybe the father came to Christ. Maybe he died some point in there. Like the text doesn't say it, but Luke also doesn't say that the father was anything more than a Greek. And so I just want to start here because I think it's important when we're talking about raising children in a way that honors God. It starts first in the fact that you have to raise them in the communities that you're in, and those are not always easy. You have to raise them with the people that you're surrounded with, and that's not always easy. And the broken family, that might be difficult too, right? Like raising children is not going to be an easy task, but we still have to raise a child who with sincere faith, who honors God. That's the obligation that God has called us to, right? So I got 3 things that I think we can really see out of this text. And if you turn back to 2 Timothy, I'm going to show you 3 things that I think Eunice and Lois really did right. The first thing I think they did right is they laid out a godly example. The first thing they did right is they laid out a godly example. And I don't know how that actually worked within the family structure that Timothy was in. But I know that when Paul starts in verse 3, he says, I thank God whom I serve as my ancestors did with a clear conscience, as night and day I constantly remember you in my prayers, recalling your tears. I long to see you so that I may be filled with joy. See, Timothy was the kind of guy that you wanted to have around. Right? We all know the kind of guys that we want, or girls. We know the kind of people that we enjoy having around, right? Like I can think of several within the church, like that I know I can count on. And when I think of them, the first response, the first thing I do is I begin to thank God for them because I know I can always count on them. And then there are the people that we don't really like to have around, right? Like, oh man, that person's here. Were you raised by wolves or something? Like. How is it that you're here? And I wonder, like, what made Timothy be that kind of person that Paul could count on and Paul enjoyed having him around? By the way, if you look at verse 2, when he writes to Timothy, he calls him his dear son, right? So Paul and Timothy had this close, strong relationship that Paul wanted Timothy around. It's the point of the letter. I'm hoping to see you soon, right? When I think of a character like that, I think he must have had good parents. Because I know for sure I take on a lot of the attributes, good or bad, of my parents. And I know you probably do too, right? In fact, those people who have children here that I know your parents, I know that there's some things that you do that's just like your mom. For me, one of the things I do that's just like my mom is I'm late for everything and I forget stuff, right? So we'll be about ready to leave our house, and I'll have to run back inside, and January will say, okay, Bonnie Collins, right? Because we all know, I've left something, right? That's something I got from my mom, one of those attributes. I think Timothy got the kind of attribute that you wanted to be around, because when Paul wants to thank God for Timothy, he can't do it without remembering his mom and his grandma. And if you look with me at Philippians chapter 2, verse 19, Paul talks about the character of Timothy. He says this, I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, that I might be cheered when I receive news about you. I have no one else like him who will show genuine concern for your welfare, for everyone looks out for their own interests, not those of Jesus. But you know that Timothy has proven himself, because as a son with his father, he has served with me in the working of the gospel. Timothy was the kind of person that showed genuine concern. And I want you to circle that word genuine, because that describes Timothy, that describes Lois, that describes Eunice. They're genuine people, right? The kind of people that you want to be around. That's why I'm saying they laid out an example, right? They laid out a godly example. And I believe that Timothy did this because he saw his grandma, Lois, being the kind of person that you want to be around. And I think he saw it in his mom, the kind of person that you want to be around. And that was contagious because that's his heritage. And I'm just trying to point out to mothers here, you are supposed to be a godly example because your kids follow you, right? Your kids are watching you. And the way that they grow up is kind of reflecting what values you taught them. And so here's Timothy. He's somebody that Paul wants to thank God for. He's remembering him, and he's remembering him in his tears. And like all those people that think what it means to raise a godly man is to raise somebody that doesn't cry, that's not Timothy. In fact, the one thing that Paul remembers when he's thinking about Timothy is all of the tears from the last time he saw him. Timothy wasn't this macho man. He was somebody who was genuine, somebody who showed genuine concern. In fact, he cried for Paul the last time that he saw him. And we think, at least it seems as if maybe Timothy was in that group in Acts chapter 20 when Paul is telling him he's going to Jerusalem and you might not see me anymore. And Timothy is in that group crying and saying, don't go. And they're really crying and hugging each other because they don't want to see Paul go and be turned over to whatever might happen to him there. And so Paul is thinking back as he's in prison. He's thinking back to Timothy and he's saying, you're the kind of person. I can't wait to see you so that I can find real joy, right? because they laid out a godly example that Timothy followed. My second point is this. Lois and Eunice lived out an example of sincere faith. Lois and Eunice lived out an example of sincere faith. Now, this would have been difficult for him because where did Timothy grow up? You should say Lystra. Was his family intact, or was it one Jewish woman and one Greek? It was one Jewish woman and one Greek. It would have been difficult to show him sincere faith in this divided world. But they do. And so Paul says that in verse 5. I'm reminded of your sincere faith which lived in you, which lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded now also lives in you. See, the heritage that Timothy took from his grandma and his mother was to be sincere in his faith, or genuine in his faith. And that's what the word means, sincere. It means genuine. If you want to think of it like in a different sense, it also can be translated a non-hypocritical. So when you think of the hypocrite, think of what Jesus is talking about when he talks about the hypocrite. And he says, they pray so that they can be heard, right? They fast so they disfigure their faces so everybody can see just how pious they are. They give, but so everybody can see what they're giving, right? Like everything they're doing is to receive this attention, right? It's not genuine. It's not sincere. It's hypocritical. What it means to be genuine and to have a genuine faith is to have a faith that is sincere both on the outside and the inside. That was Jesus's critique of the Pharisees. The cup is clean on the outside and beautiful, but inside it's dirty, right? And to have sincere faith is to be a genuine person from the outside and the inside. That's what it means. And I think of Lois and Eunice, and what they showed their son Timothy is that what they believed, they lived out. And I can think of no better thing that you can tell your children or demonstrate to your children that is than what you believe is also what you live out. See, I think there are a lot of times where we wonder, what happened with my children? They grow up and they struggle. And I think that's true of all children. They grow up and they struggle. But when kids see, and just think about this for a second. When you come to church, you're all buttoned up, right? You got the nice clothes. You're putting on the show that you want everyone to see, right? And maybe that's sincere, maybe it's not, but you're all buttoned up. This is me. This is how I want everyone to perceive me. But when you go home, you got to, loosen up the tie. You got to take the buttons off. Your kids get a view of your life that is different than anybody here in this church. Your kids get to see stop shaking your head, Isaiah. Your kids get to see the genuine you, the sincere you. They get to see the person who's frustrated when they get off of work, or when they get, and by the way, most of the time they're frustrated with their kids, so they get the sharp end of the anger situation, right? They see if this is so hard being this is why preachers' kids have it so tough. They see what I'm saying from up here, but then they also get to see how I'm living outside of here. And what a awesome responsibility you have as a parent to show your kids that you are genuine both on the outside and the inside, that you have a sincere faith. And what does that even look like? How do we know that somebody has sincere faith from the inside to the outside? And that's not the only time Paul uses the term sincere faith. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5, it says this: the goal of this command is love, which comes from a pure heart, a good conscience, and sincere faith. Right? So how do we know somebody has sincere faith? Love, right? That's the key to sincere faith. When you show genuine love, the first fruit of the Spirit, when you show genuine love, you're showing sincere faith. And I want parents to know that when you go home, your kids are seeing that. Look at 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 14, because this is how they raised Timothy in a land that was full of pagans and idol worships, in a broken home. This is how they raised Timothy to be a person who honors God. In verse 14, it says, "But as for you, continue in what you have learned and have become convinced of, because you know those from whom you have learned it, and how from infancy you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus." So, how did Timothy grow up to be a man that honors God? He remembered what he learned, right? The Holy Scriptures. But just as important, he remembered who he learned it from. See, that's what it says. Convinced of, because you know those whom you learned it from. He saw first, before he could ever be convinced in the text, he saw first a genuine love for the text by his mother and his grandmother. And that was so much more convincing than any apologetic proof that you might be able to offer someone. If you want to really tell somebody how important this text is, then live it out. That's what it really comes down to, living out the text. Because it's not just that he's supposed to remember the text that he learned in the Holy Scriptures that he learned as an infant, from the time he was an infant, but he's supposed to remember those he learned it from. Because they were genuine people, his mother, his grandmother. They were godly examples that showed him how to live out that text. And God's word is living and active. It's God-breathed. It's useful for teaching, correcting, rebuking, right? And Paul's calling him back to that. Remember that. And I just think that's a beautiful idea. And it's just an encouragement to parents that as you go home, if you're not living a genuine example of Christianity, if you're not being a sincere person, your kids will be the first to see it and call bull. And then you'll wonder years later, what happened? Now, lots of things could happen. I mean, I don't know what went on in each family, but I know one thing that could train wreck somebody's faith is to see a hypocritical faith and think that's the kind of faith that I need to follow. But Timothy doesn't get a hypocritical faith, he gets a sincere faith. And Paul is convinced, go back to chapter 1, Paul is convinced that this sincere faith, which first lived inside of his grandmother Lois, and now in his mother Eunice, and I am persuaded lives in you also, right? That's going to bring me to my third point. Lois and Eunice left an example to draw strength from. And just think about the way that Paul words this. Because tense matters, right? And when he says this, and he's talking about the faith that lived, past tense, in Lois and Eunice, and now lives in you also. I think there's a tragic part of what Timothy has to remember about his mom. See, the faith once lived in her. But maybe now that hope has been realized, maybe she's been called to be at home with the Lord. And now she's just the example that you look back to. And I know, honestly, that this is the message that more of you guys can relate with, because you might have mothers that when you think about Mother's Day, it's more of a sting than it is a joy, because you're remembering your mom who had a sincere faith that lived past tense inside of her and now lives present tense inside of you. And I know that's more on where a lot of you are at, but I think Mother's Day can be that too. A day where we remember and are recalled back to those examples of godly parents, godly mothers who show us what it means to really have a sincere faith. And I think that's really important, because Paul in this text says, I'm persuaded, right, now lives in you also. But I think Paul already knew that this faith lived in Timothy. I think he's writing this to Timothy to persuade him that the same sincere faith that lived inside of his mother and his grandmother also lives in him. And I think that's an important thought that we have to that he wrestles with, that Timothy wrestles with. Because see, he's called to be a pastor to the church of Ephesus, and that's not an easy job. It's going to be a difficult task. There's lots of false teaching that he's got to deal with. There's lots of problems in the Ephesian church, and he's going to need strength to do it. And Paul has told him twice where to draw his strength from. The Holy Scriptures. Remember the sincere faith of your mother and your grandmother. And if you look at verse 6, it says, "For this reason I remind you to fan the flame of the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For the Spirit of God does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline." There is something that remembering his mother and fanning the flame of the gift that Paul gave to him when he laid on his hand is going to help him accomplish. And that's that he doesn't need to be timid, but he can be powerful. And I think as we consider that, his mother left him a godly example of what it means to live out a Christian faith, even when you're going through difficult times. And he could continue throughout the rest of his life to remember the faith that once lived in his grandmother and his mother and now lives in him. As I think about this, we've gone through this whole sermon talking about what it means to be a godly mother who raises their kids up, shows them what it means to be a God follower, shows sincere faith, a non-hypocritical faith, and gives an example to provide strength for what lays ahead. But I realize I'm not talking to many mothers. And I think that's okay. Because if you go back to verse 2, Paul calls Timothy his dear son. But Timothy's not his son. In fact, we know Timothy's father was a Greek, and Paul's definitely not a Greek, right? But Paul understood that as a Christian, it was his job, mother or not, to treat people as they are his son. That's how he was his son, but he wasn't even related by blood. I wonder how many people here are mentoring and bringing up people, and if you're not, you should be. Because being a father, being a mother, doesn't just start whenever you have a child. There are people inside this church that you could show an example of sincere faith to. There are people inside this church that when they look at you and your example, they can be strengthened to go through whatever problems they're going to be having in life. And so I know I'm not talking to mothers, but I'm asking you to be, although I am talking to some mothers, I'm asking everyone to be like a mother. And I'm asking you to be like a father. Because that's what it means to truly disciple people, is to be like a mother and like a father, and to show sincere faith to those around us.